Well, good morning, Rowville. Happy Sabbath. I tell you what, it's fantastic to be back worshipping with you all this morning. It's been, I think, over 2 years now since I've last been part of a full service in a church. I work in aged care, so we've been on heavy lockdown. I had a stint up in Canberra. I caught the bug. I got better from the bug, and obviously I've been jabbed 3 times. So it's been quite an entertaining period for me and my wife, but it's great to be back worshipping in a church with you all this morning. Happily today, I'm here to talk about one of my favourite biblical characters. And the character we're going to study today is one that I heard a lot about growing up as a small boy. Now, it may come as a surprise to those of you who know my relatives, but when I was a younger man, I was not widely regarded as a particularly obedient sort. I believe I spent almost every lunchtime in grade 4 on detention for disobedience of one sort or another. And for some unknown reason, the older people in my life felt that I needed to learn some lessons from this particular Bible character. One of my grandmothers in particular had a real fondness for recounting his tale while giving me looks that were, in hindsight, rather obvious. Now, clearly something got through, because otherwise I wouldn't be up here today with you all. But as I've gotten older, I finished 2 degrees, one of which was an ancient history degree, and I've studied the Old Testament in my own time a bit more. I have realised that this particular character, I would argue, is one of the least understood characters in the Old Testament. His kingship and his reign is particularly misunderstood. I am, of course, referring to David's grandson through Solomon, King Rehoboam. And isn't that an introduction? Grandson of the mightiest warrior king of Israel, and the son of the wisest and probably wealthiest king ever. Big shoes to fill. Now, why do I say that King Rehoboam is misunderstood? Let's turn to 1 Kings chapter 12 to have a bit of a read of his short story. A story that I was all too familiar with as a young man. 1 Kings chapter 12 verses 3 to 16. And I will be reading from the New Living Translation. The leaders of Israel summoned him, and Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel went to speak with Rehoboam. Your father was a hard master, they said. Lighten the harsh labour demands and the heavy taxes that your father imposed upon us. And then, only then we will be your loyal subjects. Rehoboam replied, give me 3 days to think this over, and then come back for my answer. So the people went away. King Rehoboam then discussed the matter with the older men who had counselled his father Solomon. What is your advice? He asked. How should I answer these people? The older counsellors replied, if you are willing to be a servant to these people today and to give them a favourable answer, they will always be your loyal subjects. But Rehoboam rejected the advice of the older men, and instead he asked the opinion of the young men who had grown up with him and were now his advisors. What is your advice? He asked them. How should I answer these people who want me to lighten the burdens imposed by my father? The young men replied, this is what you should tell those complainers who want a lighter burden. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. Yes, My father laid heavy burdens on you, but I'm going to make them even heavier. My father beat you with whips, but I will beat you with scorpions." 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to hear Rehoboam's decision, just as the king had ordered. But Rehoboam spoke harshly to the people, for he rejected the advice of the older counselors. And he followed the counsel of his young advisors. He told the people, "My father laid heavy burdens on you, but I'm going to make them even heavier. My father beat you with whips, but I will beat you with scorpions." And so the king paid no attention to the people, and this turn of events was the will of the Lord, for it fulfilled the Lord's message to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through the prophet Ahijah from Shiloh. When all Israel realized that the king had refused to listen to them, they responded, "Down with the dynasty of David. We have no interest in the son of Jesse. Back to your homes, O Israel. Look to your own house, O David." Now, obviously, very, very clearly, at least in my grandmother's eyes, the takeaway point from that passage is listen to older people, right? Don't listen to your friends' advice. Listen to your parents, your grandparents, and their friends. At least, that is what I was told. Unfortunately, Rehoboam's story is a little more nuanced than that. There are a few details that are glossed over, a few facts that are conveniently ignored, and a few realities that are all too happily sidestepped. In order to understand the story of Rehoboam, you have to understand the story of Israel's unification. And the story of Israel's unification starts at the end of the most confronting book in the Bible, the book of Judges. If you turn with me to Judges chapter 21, verse 25, you can read the words, "In those days Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes." And often we ask, well, what on earth does that mean? And the period of the Judges is also known as the Warlord Era of Israel. And I don't want to go into too much detail because the book of Judges deserves really a whole year's worth of sermons. But the brief overview is that Israel was a chaotic, bloody, and desperate place to live during the time of the Judges. It is sometimes referred to as the Warlord Era by secular historians, and it's basically noted for having the following attributes. There's no central authority, either secular or theocratic. The superpowers of the era, Egypt to the south and the Hittites to the north, basically leave the savage hill people alone, mostly because their chariots are useless in the hills and mountains of Israel, but also because, really, who'd want to rule over the meddlesome and quarrelsome Israelites? There are countless strongmen or local thugs who build their powers through clans, strength of arms, and local religious sites. High places, idols, sacred groves. These all lend these local thugs authority, legitimacy, and wealth. And we read about these in Judges 17. These thugs we can refer to as pseudo-nobility, or just thugs. Both titles work equally well. They are violent, godless men for the most part. Really, the only thing tying Israel together during this period are some cultural and vague religious ties, mostly maintained through the continued efforts of the Levites, who moved throughout the disparate tribes, working as a priestly class. There are some efforts to centralise under the various judges, and most notably under Abimelech in Judges 9, who briefly claims kingship. And then there is, of course, the slightly more successful effort under King Saul, though even this pretty clearly fails. And if you look very closely at the story, while he can theoretically claim to rule 12 tribes of Israel, in reality he can barely eke out 3. And striding into this mess, striding into the horror story that is the Warlord Era of Israel, comes a shepherd boy from a minor noble family. And there is one thing that this shepherd is really, really, really good at: killing. He's not too bad with a harp as well. David, son of Jesse, kills a giant champion when he's a boy. By the time he is a young man, the locals are singing of his slaying of tens of thousands. He is exiled to his enemies, who recognise his talents and try to make a use of him. He leads a warrior band, David's mighty men, who are infamous for their skill and brutality. Interestingly, a large part of his army is made up of mercenaries that he's roped in from all around. The Kerethites, the Pelethites, and the Gittites, all of which are referenced in 2 Samuel 15. And so this shepherd David, through strength of arms, a blessed strength of arms, conquers Israel and becomes king. I've always wondered what David could accomplish had he been born into a militaristic society like Rome. It's a scary thought. His accomplishments when coming from a barbaric collection of hill tribesmen are simply incomparable. And so David accomplishes the impossible. He unites by force of arms and by the will of God 12 tribes of Israel. And importantly, his real triumph is that he undermines the authority of the local thugs by annihilating their religious legitimacy. He destroys their power base systematically, cutting down the Asherah poles, levelling the high places, destroying the sacred groves. And anyone who objects, it's my way or the highway. The most notable effort to centralise religion we find in 2 Samuel chapter 6, when David brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Now, all of David's violence and reforms obviously upset a lot of people, but he doesn't care. He is so dominant militarily that he just kills anyone who fights against his reforms. We look at the civil war between David and Absalom to give us an idea of just how upset the people of Israel were. If you look at 2 Samuel chapter 15, you see that almost the entirety of Israel tries to unite against David in support of his son. He flees Jerusalem with a band of mercenaries at his back, and yet he turns around and crushes the rebellion. Eventually, David dies, and he leaves a battered and bruised Israel behind him. But importantly, it is an united Israel. It's an Israel that is united and ready to flourish. And flourish it does. Solomon is not a great warrior by any means. Indeed, at the end of his reign, he loses a number of revolts in areas that he really should have won with his fancy pants and very expensive army. And you read about them in 1 Kings 11. While Solomon doesn't take after his father in military skill, Solomon is without a doubt the greatest diplomat of all time. Through his wisdom, he forges alliances with almost every man and his dog. We can see this in two ways very clearly. The wealth through trade that Solomon is able to accrue is truly extraordinary. Remember that his power base lies in the hills and mountains of Israel, and yet 1 Kings chapter 10:22 tells us that he has a fleet of trading ships. Just as today all trade hinges on diplomacy, so too did it hinge on diplomacy back then. And the main way that diplomatic ties and deals were agreed to was through marriage. If former President Trump had been alive in the so-called Iron Age, he wouldn't have written The Art of the Deal, he would have written A Guide to Good Marriage. In the time of Solomon, any and all state-level deals were almost always underpinned by state-level marriages. The bigger the deal, the bigger the marriage. And it is important to note that the deals usually only last as long as the marriage. When one of the spouses dies, the deal's over unless you remarry into the family again. Solomon's greatest diplomatic coup is when he marries into the royal family of Egypt, providing him with a superpower for protection in much the same way Australia relies on America for protection from Indonesia, China, and India. Solomon's reign is built brick by brick on diplomacy and the forced unity of bloodshed from his father. But then the question comes, what happens when the diplomacy disappears? What happens when all the deals stop? And what happens when the bloodshed is forgotten? And even more importantly, what happens when Solomon starts to let the local thugs have their gods back? Well, it's an absolute disaster. Rehoboam comes to the throne with an economy that is about to go through the equivalent of the Great Depression, the GFC, and the tulip bubble all at once. All of Solomon's wealth-driving trade deals stop on his death. If Rehoboam is lucky, he might be able to drag them out a year or two. Maybe get another marriage, tie it in. But the times have changed. And importantly, just as all the deals stop, all the costs keep going. Remember Solomon's palace building spree. Palace for this wife, palace for that wife, palace for myself. On and on it goes. They all cost money. Upkeep is a thing. On top of that, Rehoboam faces invasion from a resurgent Hittite empire that's nibbling at his north, and a new Egyptian pharaoh to the south, who 5 years later does invade, but at the time is making preparations to invade. And he faces all of this military threat with arguably the most ridiculously expensive and useless army ever to be fielded in history. Solomon has equipped soldiers with gold-plated shields. He has chariots, which are extraordinarily expensive to maintain and utterly useless in Israel, which is full of hills and mountains. Finally, and arguably most importantly, Rehoboam is up against a pack of nobles who have been re-empowered by Solomon's religious collapse. Nobles who are all throwing their support behind a strong aristocrat from debatably the largest and wealthiest of the tribes in Israel, the tribe of Ephraim. He is an aristocrat who already has enough support to seemingly waltz back from exile and wander into a meeting as a leader with the new king. And then the ultimatum is given. Lower taxes, be kind, or else. Now let me make one thing very clear. Nobles, leaders, tribal elders, thugs, whatever. It doesn't matter. They always, and I mean always, ask the new king for less taxes and more power. It doesn't matter if they were paying no taxes and had almost all of the power, they will still request less and more respectively. Rehoboam should be expecting this ultimatum. It's one that almost every single ruler since the dawn of time has had to face. And Rehoboam turns to the advisors of Solomon. The advisors of Solomon presumably are very wise, except we forget how Solomon's reign really went. These are all elders, we're told. And now I don't want to go casting theories out into the wilderness here, but it seems to me that they might not be the most impartial of advisors in this instance. Presumably, they were the ones advising Solomon towards the latter half of his reign. They were likely the ones that helped to decentralise the religious reforms of David, that aided the failure that was Solomon's military efforts, and probably they were or had friends amongst the leaders of the assembly of Israel. When we remember that, it's unsurprising that their advice is give the nobles what they want. Hey, just let it happen. If you give them what they want, they will definitely serve you later. We promise. Can I just say that when I studied history, I was very hard pressed to find an instance of that being true. When you give the nobility an inch, they take a mile. Just ask King John of England. Indeed, if there are any teachers here, they will know that it is easier to start with a tough facade and gradually soften than to start soft and suddenly have to invoke harsher discipline. The old men's advice is nice, but it's wrong. And I like to think that Rehoboam realises this. So he turns to the young men who had grown up with him, men who are probably around the age of 40, if tradition is correct. Rather predictably, they go the opposite way. If your dad was hard, you're going to be twice as hard. Rah! They're probably referring to David's efforts in their arguments, pointing out the effectiveness of a strong, militaristic leader. No doubt there was much chest thumping in the meeting. You certainly get the impression that the author was unimpressed by their view on matters. And while the young men are wrong, they aren't nearly as wrong as the older generation. Their problem isn't in advising Rehoboam to be strong. Their problem is that he doesn't have any strength. They fail to recognise that the new king actually needs to be in a position of strength to be strong. And they also probably learn that there's a more diplomatic way, and I don't believe scorpions are generally invoked in that. Rehoboam is in such a weak position that he cannot make the strongman argument. He can't play the strongman game. There is no way he can do it and get away with it. The young men's advice is wrong. The elders' advice is wrong. So what choice did Rehoboam have? He couldn't tell the nobles to nick off, nor could he give in to their demands. He didn't have the strength for the first and the economic and cultural power for the second. But when you read this story, there is one thing missing. There is one character that doesn't make an appearance. When you read the story in 1 Kings chapter 12, God is conspicuously absent. And it's not as though Rehoboam couldn't have consulted God. King David and King Solomon both seem to have had ready access to prophets and seers. Indeed, Rehoboam, mere months later, is directly confronted by one. And if we look back at 1 Kings chapter 11, we can see that God warns that this mess is coming. He tells Solomon directly that his line will lose the kingship as a result of his various failures. And then later on he tells Jeroboam a similar thing. Solomon's failures will lead to you having 10 of the tribes, because Solomon has failed to follow God's laws and ways. It is interesting to note that God gives the line of David a way out in these prophecies. When he promises the kingship to Jeroboam, he doesn't put a time limit on how long it would be for. I feel that it seems possible that God would have cut Jeroboam's disastrous reign short and restored Israel if the young king had reached out to God and followed him as his grandfather did. It's a fascinating thought to consider. What if Rehoboam had asked the advice of God? Now then, what is the lesson to be drawn? Unfortunately for my grandmothers and elders, they will have to turn to other stories in the Bible for examples of wise old men. The reality is, unfortunately, rich or poor, young or old, fat or skinny, we are all sinners. We all make mistakes. We all give the wrong advice at times. Instead, the lesson we have to remember, the lesson that we have to draw on, is we can always look to God. We should never forget him in the toughest moments of our life, and never think that he isn't ready to provide you with comfort or hope in the darkest times that you face. For after all, God gave his own Son so that if we consult him and if we choose him, we can pass through the shadow of the grave and into eternal life with him in heaven. We just have to seek his advice. Our Father in heaven, Thank you that you are always there and willing to give us advice. Thank you that you are always there for us to seek out should we need it. Please help us to remember that you are always there for us, and help us to reflect you in whatever we do through the coming week. In your name I pray. Amen.